Agenda meeting to order. If the clerk could please call the roll.
Commissioner Beely,
Here.
Commissioner Hortko,
Here.
Commissioner Horn,
Here.
Chairman Davidson,
Present.
Commissioner Kaufman,
Here.
Commissioner Rafak,
Here.
Commissioner Riggs, Commissioner Rodriguez.
Here's Commissioner Riggs. Did we hear from Commissioner Rodriguez?
I spoke to him on Friday and thought he was going to be attending. He
Okay.
didn't say he went, so.
Okay, fair enough. The minutes for the October 8th, 2019 meeting have been distributed to all members. If anyone has any corrections, deletions, or additions to the minutes, I'd entertain them. Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
Moved by Commissioner Biley, seconded by Commissioner Horn. Clerk, call the roll, please.
Commissioner Beely,
Aye.
Commissioner Hertko,
Aye.
Commissioner Horn,
Aye.
Chairman Davidson,
Aye.
Commissioner Kaufman, Commissioner Rafak,
Aye.
Commissioner Riggs.
Aye.
Motion carries. I'm going to take the liberty of moving the citizens to be heard just slightly back, just because I think from a procedural standpoint, it might be best to, Allison, have you go first regarding the alternative water study status schedule update. So why don't you start with agenda 4.
Okay, thank you and welcome everyone to the December 10th Environmental Commission meeting. As we always do start these meetings, I will just run through the information summarizing what we've been doing for the past 18 months, as well as what we've been doing since the last meeting. So again, phase 1 was completed in January 2019. That began in August of 2018 and narrowed 14 alternative water source options down to the 5 viable alternatives that were studied further during phase 2. Phase 2 began in February and is wrapping up in December, so we are almost complete. Phase 2 was a detailed analysis of the 5 options identified in phase 1. With the identification of improvements for each alternative, we developed the associated cost, and then also considered each alternative based on the phase 2 criteria, which we spent a lot of time discussing throughout the year at workshops with the City Council and the Environmental Commission. And finally then, at the end of phase 2, we're going to select an alternative water source for the City of Joliet. The phase 2 study looked at the 5 alternatives listed on the screen: the Kankakee River, the Illinois River, and 3 variations on Lake Michigan water. Per a letter dated December 4th from DuPage Water Commission, they do not want to be considered as an alternative water source supplier for the City of Joliet, so therefore that evaluation has been removed from the phase 2 study, and they're no longer being considered as an alternative water source for Joliet. This map shows the locations of the 4 potential alternative water sources. We always put this map up here as perspective to show that none of the alternatives are close to Joliet. So phase 2 goals. We wanted to, as I already mentioned, determine the extent of improvements required to for the selected water source alternatives to establish the total water costs associated with each alternative. We wanted to further refine and prioritize the phase 2 decision criteria. These were the total cost of water, raw water quality, sustainability and water quantity, implementation risk, operation and maintenance, and control/governance. We wanted to continue the stakeholder engagement that began during phase 1, understanding the importance of making sure that the public was engaged with the study, and then provide information necessary for the City Council to select an alternative water source. I'll just say also that this was done in a transparent manner under the guidance of the Environmental Commission. It was also an unbiased study that was led by a team of experts in the water industry, each with a specialty in the 3 main water types that we investigated. That would be river water sources, Lake Michigan, and groundwater sources. So now that we're at the end of the study, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit why we've been working on this for the past 18 months. I understand there's been some questions about the need to find an alternative water source. So Daniel Abram with the Illinois State Water Survey is here, and I've asked him to briefly comment on the research and modeling that he has done that we're using for the basis of the time frame for switching water sources. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you and good evening. Again, my name is Daniel Abrams from the Illinois State Water Survey. And just a little background, in 2017, we released a report that I know a lot of you are aware of that highlighted that there would be issues on a regional scale in the sandstone aquifer by 2017 or by 2040. And as part of the outcome of that report, we were approached by officials from the city of Joliet to look into this and do a local scale analysis and improve on that regional assessment that we did in that report. And that was released in early 2019 in the Phase 1 study. And that can be found in the Phase 1 report. And the findings were that existing wells would not be able to meet projected demands by the year 2030 under the current trend scenario. Now, there were multiple scenarios that we looked at. 5 of the 6 found the same thing, that by the year 2030. And what you see here in the graph is one of those plots, and the 3 wells listed, 15, 17, and 28. The one scenario that did show that supply could last past 2030 was the least resource intensive scenario. That found 2 wells that would have issues before the year 2040 in the city of Joliet. And also, just to note, the LRI scenario has almost no growth for the city of Joliet. So to put into perspective some of the findings. And I also just want to point out the importance that the aquifer levels in Joliet are lower than we've seen before, and we continue to investigate this regionally. We're conducting a regional study with many of the communities surrounding Joliet, as well as some of the industries in the region. And that includes monthly data collection, monthly water level collection, and we continue to find support that 2030 is the point that maximum data demands won't be able to be met by a few wells. And the implication of that is if those wells can't meet maximum daily demands, other wells would have to pick up the slack. And by the time you get to 3 wells, that becomes very challenging to manage. There are other complexities in the region that are hampering this, the Sandwich Fault Zone and multi-aquifer wells. We continue to gain insight on those, and they all continue to point to 2030 as being a year that action would need to occur because of these complicated geologic factors. Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, so I just wanted to run through the items that we have completed since the last Environmental Commission meeting on October 8th. The independent cost review was completed. We also completed the draft Phase 2 report, which was distributed at the joint workshop, which was held on November 13th. We've also developed 2 Q&A documents that have been distributed to the Environmental Commission and City Council, as well as being made publicly available on the project website. These were Part 1 and Part 2, and you can see the dates that they were distributed. And then also, last Thursday, we held the public forum on December 5th, which was well attended. There's been questions regarding the public relations that have been conducted during Phase 2, so I wanted to take a moment to remind everyone about the extensive outreach that we did during Phase 2. We hired a public relations firm, Images Inc. They developed a public relations plan to guide us through Phase 2, which we have implemented over the past 11 months. And this list here highlights all of the efforts that have been made to engage the community. A stakeholder group with over 800 members has been compiled, with e-blasts being sent. We have been utilizing the city's electronic billboards to promote information regarding meetings as well as water conservation efforts. There have been articles in the city newsletter that is distributed to all city residents. There was an insert in the utility bill that was distributed in about June in conjunction with the community survey that was prepared. We have a project-specific website. There's been, as of today, over 1,000 visitors to the project website. There were 6 press releases issued. Staff members from the utilities department attended 9 community events, again, with the idea of taking the message to the people where they are going to be at and not expecting people to come to meetings such as these. There's been 21 presentations to various organizations that includes the neighborhood council groups, Chamber, Lions, many community groups that we made presentations to. We hosted the public forum and then also had 116 social media posts. This was all done in addition to the 10 environmental commission meetings and 3 joint workshops with the city council and environmental commission. As I mentioned, we have completed an independent cost review. It was important and identified in the scope of work that we wanted to have an independent firm review the cost estimates given the significance of the information. So CDM Smith was selected in September by a selection committee, which consisted of city staff as well as environmental commission members. We provided information to them that they utilized then in October to conduct their review. We met with them in November to review their comments, and then we modified the cost estimates based on those comments. And all the comments and our responses have been incorporated into the draft phase 2 report in Appendix N. So if there's any questions about the independent cost review, I could entertain them now. Okay. The joint workshop. It was important that the City Council and Environmental Commission have an opportunity to receive the results of the Phase 2 study. This was held on November 13th. At that presentation, staff provided their recommendations of the 3 alternatives that we believe are best for the city of Joliet. This would be the Illinois River at any location between Dresden Pool and Marcellus Pool, Lake Michigan through the Chicago Department of Water Management, or Lake Michigan water through the new Indiana intake. We presented a weighted decision matrix tool, which was provided to the City Council, Environmental Commission, and the public as a tool that you could use in the decision-making process. We understand this is a very complex issue, and that tool will be a way to help guide in the decision-making process. And then the last item at the workshop that we discussed was the selection schedule and post-selection schedule. So at the, as I mentioned, we've been providing the Q&A parts 1 and 2 on the website, as well as to the Environmental Commission and City Council. There were a few questions that came up at the public forum during the public comment section that we had not had an opportunity to respond to in a meeting. So I wanted to take the opportunity now to provide the answers to those questions, as we feel they're important given the discussions that have been had after the public forum. So these are the 4 questions that, again, have generated some interest following the public forum. So I will go ahead and answer the first one and then turn it over to the rest of the project team to address the other questions. So the first question was related to the impact of the new water source on property values. This question came up initially during the workshop. The answer to this question was provided in the first part of the Q&A, which was distributed in November. So to provide a response to this, city staff contacted a MAI certified residential and commercial property appraisal firm that is located in Joliet. That firm indicated that they don't find any evidence in the market that one public water source impacts property values any more than another. Although Chicago water is generally regarded as very good and might even be preferred by some communities and/or developers, there is no evidence that properties using Chicago water sell for a premium value. The only thing that they see that could be a significant impact is if one source of water results in substantially higher water or sewer rates than another source, but they indicated that even that issue would likely have minimal, if any, direct impact on property values. So again, I just wanted to provide that answer since it had come up at the public forum. Are there any additional questions regarding property values? Okay. The second question, I'll let Joe Johnson respond to. It's regarding of the regional option and what impact that could have on water rates. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Allison. So the question was, will the city collect income from regional customers, and how will a regional solution impact water rates? With regards to collecting income, that's a decision that the city council would have to make as part of the rate structure negotiations with any potential regional customers. For the cost analysis that we've done right now, we did assume that Joliet would mark up the cost of water to other regional customers by 5%. That's an assumed value basically to reflect the administrative and kind of risk responsibility the city would take on being a regional supplier. But again, that would be subject to a decision by the city council. In terms of the impact of a regional solution on water rates, with the information that was presented in the report, I think you may have seen there is in effect an economy of scale with a regional solution. So while the amount of water that is sold under the regional scenarios increases significantly, the cost doesn't go up proportionally. So that there is a slight reduction in the calculated impact on rates for a regional solution. Basically, you have an economy of scale. I think the one observation to make clear is that assumes that all of the regional customers are on board on day one and begin buying into the system. Obviously, if Joliet had to oversize the system for potential regional customers ahead of them actually coming on board, then the economy of scale would be reduced.
Are there any other questions about a regional solution and impacts on rates or costs? Okay. The next question is regarding the Kankakee River alternative and the use of reservoirs as storage to make this a viable alternative. I'll ask Teresa O'Grady to respond to this question.
So this was a question that came up before the Part 1 Q&A and was actually addressed in number 19 in the Part 1 Q&A. And one of the things that has been brought up is whether there could be either online or quarries used as reservoir storage to overcome the deficit between what the existing wells could provide as a backup versus what's available. So a couple things to note on the Kankakee River option. The low flow condition is what we're concerned about, and that changed between the Phase 1 and Phase 2 studies. And it's contained in the Phase 2 report in Appendix G. But if you look at the Joliet-only scenario, the amount of backup days required depends on the historical information you look at, and it ranges from about 3 to 4 months. And what we're saying is that during that time, Joliet would have to get off the river and use wells or use some kind of backup supply. And what we are looking at is that the wells could only provide about 2 to 3 months. And so we looked initially after this was asked before the Part 1 Q&A, and we looked at a couple of reservoirs, and in particularly we looked at quarries near Rowell Avenue and I-80, and then one near South Chicago Street and Mills Road. And we did just a quick calculation based on Google Maps, the area, and assumed a 25-foot water depth in those. And we looked at how many days of storage that could be. The amount of storage is somewhere around 340, 350 million gallons if you assume a 25-foot depth. And what that would equate to is somewhere around the 17 to 19 days. So looking at Joliet's demands, depending on whether you look at 2030 or 2050, and that's Joliet only, those quarries don't provide that backup supply. And even if you said, I'm going to use the existing wells plus quarries, it barely makes it. So part of what we're saying is that and it says it this way in the report with the Kankakee River, it would possibly supply the growth of Joliet only, potentially limiting it, and it would be difficult for that to be a regional solution, even with reservoirs being considered in the mix.
Thank you, Teresa. The last question we wanted to address that has been brought up at the public forum was regarding increased water conservation efforts. And I'll ask Jeff Freeman to respond to this.
As we've talked about throughout the study, water conservation is certainly a tool that the commission has gotten behind, staff has gotten behind, the city council has gotten behind as a means to reduce overall demand, which would typically reduce the size of facilities and reduce cost. But the reality is there isn't sufficient room within the water demands to reduce water demands down to the point where you can get what's called the sustainable yield of the aquifer. Jumping into a little bit more detail of that, when looking at water use in a community, one must remember that one community may not use water similar to another community. For instance, the land use that creates the water demand may be different in Joliet than, say, Aurora. In the Joliet instance, a good portion of the water demand throughout the community is non-residential, commercial, industrial, institutional. And it would be very difficult to lower those type of demands significantly because that water is needed for those businesses, for those jobs throughout the community. When looking at the residential portion of the community, it's actually pretty low. It's near 60 gallons per capita per day, which is pretty good. There is a little bit of room there as we've built into the calculations for outdoor water use, waste, to reduce that by a little bit, as well as changing out toilets and using lower flow fixtures, but ultimately only a small portion of that demand can ultimately be reduced. And then the last component, which we've talked a lot about, is the non-revenue water and water loss. And there is a little bit more of a sizable chunk. The good news is the city has been focusing on trying to reduce that. The current investment is $10 million per year. We looked at boosting that as high as $16 to $17 million per year, but it would take upwards of 20 years to even get the non-revenue waters down to the 10% range. From a sustainable aquifer perspective, you need to remember that not only Joliet's pulling from this aquifer, there are many other communities in this particular region, and industries are actually pulling from the aquifer as well. So it would be hard to conclude that Joliet, every other community in the area, and all the industries would be able to get below the sustainable yield of the aquifer so that water levels are no longer declining, but they're at least stable. Therefore, the city does need to look at an alternative water source to be able to supplement the aquifer moving forward and be able to achieve a long-term sustainable water supply.
Thank you, Jeff. So just briefly wanted to present the selection schedule. This was what was presented at the workshop on November 13th, with a recommendation from the Environmental Commission being made at tonight's meeting, and that recommendation being considered by the City Council on January 7th. Just wanted to remind everyone about the significant work that does lie ahead post-selection. This is really just step one. From here, we would go on to meet with potential regional partners and really identify if that regional option is something that is going to be pursued. We have to further refine and develop the funding strategy, negotiations with potential water suppliers. If that one of the options with a water supplier is selected, that negotiation, none of that was taken place in the current study, and that would have to be conducted. We would have to select an engineering design team that would do the work to make this happen in preliminary and final design. We'd have to do the actual design, and at that time we would finalize the transmission main routing and the water facility siting. As a reminder, what was provided in the Phase 2 report was conceptual. We would have to do all of the land acquisition, meet with the regulatory agencies, conduct a corrosion control study, and obtain all the necessary permits. Once that is completed, then we could begin the construction period, which we would estimate at this time to be 5 years for any of the options. We're confident that with any of the options, we could have a new source of water online by 2030 to meet the time that we can no longer rely on the current wells. So that concludes agenda item number 4.
Thank you, Allison. At this time, we'll entertain public comments on and citizens to be heard. We're going to follow the same rules that the City Council have adopted in Section 2-2025, which is that any member of the public will be allowed 4 minutes to speak. So if you haven't signed up to speak,
Come see Ann.
if you would please sign up in the back so that we can keep a record
Sign
of
up
minutes. Ann has the,
Sign up here, yeah.
the sign-ups there. Okay, so sign up if you haven't signed up, and we'll try to keep it rolling through for those who have comments. Your comments are very important to us. While people are signing up, let me just say this. This commission started, or was renewed, a little more than 2 years ago. It was originally called the Water and Refuse or some such committee. The commissioners believed that stressing the importance of sustainability was important and renaming the committee to the Environmental Commission. We've been having meetings for 2 years now to get to this point in determining a viable alternative for the city of Joliet. What is this commission and what is it not? This commission is a recommending body. It is comprised of volunteers whose names were presented to the city council, and the city council voted for to appoint each one of us to this board. I believe everyone on the board was unanimously appointed by the city council. Some have come during the process. I know at least Wayne and Doc, you joined us a little bit later. Some of us, I think most of the people left, we've been around since the beginning. At any rate, what we are not is we are making only a recommendation. The city council is free to adopt our recommendation in whole or in part, or reject that recommendation. So for those of you who are speaking tonight, it's important for you to understand, in terms of your voices being heard, that if we come to a decision this evening, that this is not the last stop. And your elected officials will be the ones that ultimately determine what the water source is for the future of the city of Joliet. So, with that being said, do you want me to take the list, or do people want to just come up?
And we'll announce the names.
Okay, perfect.
Kathy Nasios. And following will be Damon Zundich. Hello, my name is Kathy Nasios. I'm a Joliet resident. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I believe the public, knows very little about this process or the choices in front of you. I appreciate the efforts of Ms. Swisher and her team, but it has not been enough. You might be impressed by her slides showing all the community meetings she has attended and the postcards, newsletters, billboards, etc. She even did a survey of residents, and it showed that 81% knew at least something about the water surge. But only 461 people responded to that question. That means about 374 people said they know something about the water surge. That's about 2% of the population of Joliet. Today she spoke about a group of 800. That's about 0.5%. That still leaves 99.5% of Joliet residents. So to be generous, more than half the population knows very little about what's happening. It's been said that all meetings are open to the public. That's true. But it's also true that people have jobs and families, and attending meetings can be impossible. Some, maybe even like myself, have an 87-year-old mother who was hospitalized yesterday in Indiana. I should be there now, but I am here because this is so important to more people than just myself. No matter what option the commission recommends, the residents need to feel that they have been well informed, or this will become a source of unending discussion for years to come. Each plan needs to be laid out in basic terms, the pros, the cons, the conceptual costs for all aspects of the project, and a formula for how they can take their actual bill and guesstimate what it would become under each scenario should be sent to all residents. Most importantly, they need the ability to dialogue with members of the commission and the city council. And I don't mean standing up and making a 4-minute speech. This will produce the type of ownership that is needed in the community to undertake heavy water usage reduction, which will reduce the load on the aquifer. For 15 years, I was self-employed before I sold my business. For the past 15 years, I've worked for a municipality. What I have seen is there's a huge difference in the way business people spend their own money and how municipalities spend the money of others. Taking risks by giving weight to hypothetical numbers associated with hypothetical regional partners who hypothetically will purchase water from us at a hypothetical rate is a gamble with other people's money. The residents and taxpayers of this community need a stable, redundant, and affordable system of very clean drinking water. Consider the risk when you think of making hypothetical money sometime in the hypothetical future from our hypothetical regional partners. Anyone who has gotten estimates to have home improvements done has learned that it takes twice as long and costs twice as much. If we want regional partners, then we should negotiate with those partners first and choose our source only after agreements have been signed. The regional partners' consideration has already caused harm to this process. Ms. Swisher noted at the Phase 2 presentation that the Kankakee River option had fallen off the table because it couldn't be a regional supplier. This consideration has removed a viable option from the table and uncovered a bias toward the regional option. With climate change upon us, do we really want to take responsibility for the water supply of the entire region? This process needs more time. We should take as long as necessary to inform the public and make the right choice for a water source. Please delay this decision and encourage the council to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Damon Zundich.
Hello, my name is Damon Stunich, 430 North Center Street, Joliet, Illinois. First and foremost, Joliet owes its citizens a water source that is dependable, clean, and cost-effective. Joliet owes nothing to the surrounding cities and villages if it ends up costing Joliet residents more. The regional supplier option should be the last consideration if it costs Jolietans more than a Joliet-only solution. When I had mentioned in past meetings that a quarry could be utilized and would negate any low-flow concerns for the Kankakee, I was specifically thinking of the existing Vulcan quarry at Laraway Road. That quarry has been in use for some 22 years and has twice undergone expansion, with the quarry now totaling over 200 acres. I was not referring to the quarry along Rowell Avenue, nor the one at Mills and Chicago Street. So before ruling out the Kankakee, I would ask the city to sit down with Vulcan as to its intentions for the Laraway quarry 10 to 15 years from now, when the quarry is no longer usable. As a little history, back in the mid-90s, Vulcan offered their former quarry to the city of Joliet for $1, and the city walked away from that. Vulcan recently sold its Bellwood quarry to the city of Atlanta to alleviate the same concern that we have with the Kankakee, low flow conditions. Now they have a 30-day supply. Using the city's past depth guide, as Ms. O'Grady referred to it, 25 feet, as an example, the Laraway quarry would offer reserve storage of 77 days, utilizing 25 feet. A more realistic capacity at that quarry is 100 feet, which would provide 308 days of storage. Reducing our water use by following Aurora's conservation measures, supplementing the aquifer with Kankakee River water, will be by far the lowest cost alternative for Joliet's future water sourcing. Will also allow Joliet to grow over the long term. That's a win-win for the city of Joliet, and it's a win-win for the taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bruce Renwick.
Well, I've been coming to these since August of 2018, with I think 1 or 2 exceptions. So I've heard all these things debated and discussed. There are three things I'd like you to keep in mind as you vote on the agenda tonight. First of all, we've got to keep up with conservation. I'm not sure how we do it, but I'd like to see a recommendation that this committee stay in force and keep up the conservation efforts. I think conservation is your biggest win here. Having worked for a large public utility, I can tell you that conservation and efficiency can make huge differences. Secondly, source, be it river, lake, combinations, whatever, is very important. I don't want to see us doing this again in 20 or 30 years and going through and say, gee, why didn't it last? We know global climate changes are coming. I don't know how a 5-degree difference is going to affect rainfall patterns in the Midwest or snow patterns in central Canada that feed into the Great Lakes or into the Illinois and Kankakee rivers. But we need to keep that in mind. Third thing I want you to think about, cost. Joliet is not what I would consider a rich city. We have a lot of people who make fairly good money here, but we have quite a few people who don't. And I've never heard that water was not something you could, or was something you could live without. So on that issue, I think cost is important, and you need to keep that in mind. Okay, finally, I'd like to say this. I'd like to thank all of you. I've had the chance to watch you struggle with this, fight about it, argue it, push, shove, do everything but hit each other with baseball bats. And I want to tell you, I'm proud of you for that. Because they can say a lot of things about this group, but they can't say you ever walked away from it unsatisfied. Okay? I think the staff has done a reasonable job supporting you. I think the consultants have done a reasonable job. But I think it really comes down to you people. You've made the difference in this process. And I, for one, appreciate it. And I thank you for your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Joe Roth.
I don't need to say where I live in that, do I? So I'm changing the rules on this, but I'm Joseph Roth, 1419 West Acres Road, Joliet, Illinois. Like Bruce, I would like to thank you all for the work and time and effort, thankless time you've all put in, and for staff and consultants. And it has not been an easy process. It's going to continue. And but I do just want to say, like Bruce, thank you for your time and all your efforts and taking time out of your life to do this that you'll never get back. Questions I just would like to ask be addressed at the meeting today, and they may or may not be on the agenda, which is, again, like Bruce, I would like to see this commission continue as a viable entity connected with the water planning and to be an outlet and focal point for questions, comment, and information to the public. I think that's been valuable, and I think that's kind of transparency is new for the city of Joliet in my experience, but I think it's very good for it. And if you are going to be also the Water Conservation Subcommittee, again, that is needs to be a continuing effort, a continuing commitment of the city of Joliet. And if you are going to be a continuing entity, again, hopefully it'll be an aggressive schedule of when you're going to meet, time, et cetera, going through and beyond 2020. As a part of discussions next year, I think it'd be wise to also start work on a legislative agenda. You know, short, it has to be a short and a long game in this effort. What I've thought has been lacking is to start working on legislative agendas for things that would buttress this long term. Got to have a short game, got to have a long game, and you got to be able to do those concurrently. I do have questions, and maybe I'll say them on the Illinois River. You know, how sediment's going to be reduced, how debris is going to be kept out of the intake. I've been on the river when it's high, and it can be, and also the continuing question of contaminants to be discovered and future to be named, and how those are going to be addressed by water filtration, treatment, et cetera. I do admit I have a long-term preference for Lake Michigan water as a dependable quantity, dependable quality. I think it's very unfortunate that whatever has happened with the DuPage Water Commission, that they are out of this. I viewed them early on as the most financially stable, sound, and proven provider. And it's just too bad that whatever has happened, that they are no longer an option for the city, which seems to be the city working against its own self-interest in that regard. I would, and on the real estate study Allison mentioned, it's good that that was undertaken. I do have some background in real estate. I do have some questions on that, on the basis of what are really comparable communities. In northeastern Illinois, you're either on Lake Michigan, you're on groundwater, some are on the Fox. So I think those are viewed in a favorable manner. As soon as you talk about Illinois River and the Plains and the large amount of gray water, which is we're accepting from everyone upstream, the only comparable community the appraiser could look at and draw judgments on is Peoria and downstream. And I think not that that condemns his or her findings, but it does prevent a chink and a flaw in that what are your comparable, like comparable sales, comparable communities, and you really only have, I would argue in this, Peoria to look at versus others in the region because of how people in the future, businesses may view the Illinois River as a source and link that to the Des Plaines, et cetera. And I just want to point that out, in my opinion, as a weakness in that real estate study, the lack of other comparable situations and communities in northeastern Illinois to make that valuation that the water source really doesn't matter for fair market value. So I'll leave it at that. Again, thank you for everything that you've done and for this opportunity.
Thank you, Joe.
Timed that well, it was 4 minutes and 2 seconds.
Joanne Potenziani.
Hi, I'm Joanne Potenziani, a 45-plus year resident of Joliet. And I admit I'm rather new to this discussion. I have 2 questions to ponder. One of them I think is probably rhetorical. If the city knew for years that the water supply would be an issue, why didn't the city council gradually raise water rates to bank money for future construction efforts? I know that's out of your hands, but I think it's something that needs to be said. And my second is, why can't we tap into or work with the Village of New Lenox to piggyback on their pipeline of Chicago water? The pipeline already exists and has been in use since the early 2000s. I worked in New Lenox for 16 years, and for the last 10 or so of those years, enjoyed Lake Michigan water. And my final comment has to do with conservation. It is vital, especially educating the public and finding the leaks in our system. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dave Hooper.
Thank you. I'm Dave Hooper from Joliet, and I'm also a biochemist and a professor of college of natural sciences. And so I'd just like to thank you guys for doing your hard work that you've been doing. It's been tough. And I'd also like to thank the staff. They've also been working very hard to get this all done. But the big statement I'd like to say is, and finally, that we must get this one right. This is very, very important. It's not just for me or you or your kids or your grandkids. It's not for just tomorrow, today, tomorrow. It's for decades possibly. So this one we've got to get right, guys, in making these decisions. I understand if we're in Peoria. They have no other choice. But when we're 35 miles away from one of the greatest freshwater samples of high-quality water, it's not something we should not overlook as a possibility, as many of the collar cities around here are doing. I agree that there, with some of the statements that have been made in the past, there is no surface water that's basically pure, but there's a lot of degree difference between Lake Michigan water and the Des Plaines and the Dresden Pool. And so my college chemistry class, I've always had a slogan, keep it out instead of take it out. So with those concepts, basically, this should not be a political decision, but it should be one that's very essential. Mainly the fact that requirement for living is food and water, and a supply of that and healthy water. I know there are many different techniques to take and clarify and purify water. You can go on from boiling to filtration to things like the electrodialysis, reversal, nanofiltration, fluctuation. All these can be expensive, but they get more expensive the more polluted the water is. So it's going to be important that we're going to have a very, if we do go to the river water, is it going to be feasible? And I asked that question the other night on Thursday night, never really got quite solved. If there's ever been a pilot test done for a period of time, specifically, hopefully for a whole year, on this water sample, to find out if it chemically can even be put to potable conditions. And so I would like to see if that's a possibility before we'd ever make a decision on that. But that's hard to do when we're trying to rush to the time of 2030. So I agree it's going to cost a lot of money to build a new line. It's going to cost, whether it comes from the Dresden Pool or Lake Michigan. But basically, when I look at the data that was been given, it's between $2 to $3 is the maximum for a day. We keep talking in the paper about doubling, and which is double, $30 to $60. But if I can go difference between river water and Lake Michigan water for $1, I will take that to do that because of the quality and the quantity and the reliability of that water supply. So I'm not sure, I have had the convenience of having to help my daughter buy a home lately with her husband, but they've had to stay in Cook County because of his position. But every time we went to a realtor, the realtor kept saying there are two things that they ask. One is, what about the schools, and where does the water come from? And so the gold standard in those communities are always stated, Lake Michigan. So, jokingly, but in reality, I've always made the statement, I don't drink water I don't swim in. I swam in Lake Michigan, but I don't swim in the Des Plaines River. So with that, I must tell you one more final time, please get this right. This is very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody must have timed their presentations. Thank you.
Chairman, that was the last signed up speaker, but we could entertain any other comments on the agenda items at this time.
Is there any other members of the public that would wish to speak at this time? Any other members? Yes. Come forward and then probably just, you want him to sign in?
Yes, please just state your name and address.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my name is J.D. Wright. I'm at 314 Nicholson. I've lived there for about 38 years. And I just have really one question. Ms. Swisher showed the graph of the 3 wells that have been assayed, I guess, recently. And as I understand it, there are something like 20 different wells. Now, are those representative of all the wells? Are they the best wells, the deepest wells, or why were those 3, why were the statistics from those 3 presented as opposed to any others? I just wondered why that was the case. That's the only question I have.
So typically we wouldn't respond, but since it doesn't seem like we've got the wild, wild west here, I don't think there's anything wrong with getting your question answered. Who's best equipped to answer that?
Yeah, and I would like to request too, Chairman, that we be able to respond to a number of the questions that were
Oh,
raised,
sure,
if
absolutely.
that's okay.
We want to hear answers.
We intend to also.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. Do you want us to do questions
Why
now
don't
or
we-
any more
why don't we
public
go ahead
comments?
and, since that's fresh in our mind, because I'd like to know the answer to that as well.
Okay, well, since Daniel Abrams from the State Water Survey is here, I will ask him to respond to that question.
Thanks, and that's a really important question because not all of the wells in Joliet are equal. A lot of the new growth which goes into Kendall County is within something I mentioned earlier, the Sandwich Fault Zone, which is a highly complex geologic area. It's where we have wells with the porous specific capacity, and that's where a lot of the projected growth that we've been modeling is located, which is one of the major complications. But that's the major issue with those wells. Another thing to point out is that newer wells drilled after the year 1980, have been drilled only into the Ironton-Gelsville. And that's the deeper of the two aquifers. Not to get too much into the geology, but the more shallow one is the St. Peter. And that has been dewatered through years and years of withdrawals. That's basically, you can think of it as sacrificing the St. Peter, but the Ironton-Gelsville is that next line of defense. And these wells that you see are cased through the St. Peter into the Ironton-Gelsville. So two things to keep in mind of why these wells are so problematic. They're in an area of new growth with larger casings. When you case off that upper St. Peter, you lost part of your water. You basically what we call transmissivity. How much water can you get out of the aquifer? You've lost half of it in that western well field, and it's within the fault zone. And one of the biggest challenges is that new growth will need to case off the St. Peter. It's not an option. You talk to a driller, it's not an option to leave it open. That has to happen for a number of reasons. It starts to cave. You don't want to pump sand. A number of challenges there. But then within the fault zone, these wells will just have greater drawdown. So that's the primary reason, and something very similar that all of these wells have in common.
And Daniel, when these wells, these are the ones that are identified as by not being able to meet demands by 2030, but when they fail to meet demands, that impacts the other wells that are not shown on here. So
Yes,
it's not
that's
just these wells have a problem, it will then spread to the other wells as well.
That's exactly right, and it's important to point out these are high-capacity wells. These are some of the biggest pumpers. So not all of the 20 wells have that same demand evenly distributed. And when these are lost, and you're now trying to replace that pumpage with the remaining wells in the region, that becomes cumbersome to think of it as shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. I have a coworker who likes to say that the water levels are declining. You can reorganize pumpage to a point, but from our model simulations, that point is 3 wells. After you lose those 3 wells, when we do model simulations where we try to smear that pumpage to the rest of the wells, it's no longer a sustainable situation, and those wells quickly lose. And if you look at the table in the Phase 1 report, you'll see that shortly after 2030, we're talking 2 or 3 years before an additional 5 wells go off. And I should say 3 to 5. I can't remember the exact number. But additional wells start going out very shortly after 2030 once this happens. And it's because of that redistribution of pumpage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Were you taking notes on the questions that you wanted? Oh, okay, thank you.
So one question was regarding pilot testing on the Illinois River. And I did want to, report that their pilot testing was not conducted. We did meet with the IEPA and provided river sampling data to them, and they did provide some initial findings. And I'll ask Teresa O'Grady to elaborate on that.
So the city conducted about 4 months of river water sampling, pretty much all the contaminants you can think of, from basic water quality parameters to emerging contaminants, PFAS, PFAS, pharmaceuticals and personal care products. All the information and the test results are in the Phase 2 report, but that was all sent to IEPA. And we asked them for a determination to see if the city would be able to use the Illinois River as a raw water source. We asked them 2 things. First of all, were there any red flags in the information provided that would indicate that it wouldn't be able to be used as a raw water source? And the response to that was no. So there's no red flags that they saw in all the data presented. The other thing we said is, based on the information presented, is there any advanced treatment that would be required? And they said no, based on the information that had been done, and it's 4 months of sampling, that there isn't any advanced treatment that would be required to treat the Illinois River water to finished water quality standards.
We also inquired regarding additional sampling, and so the IEPA would require additional sampling if the Illinois River was selected. And Teresa, was it at least an additional year?
They said a minimum of 12 months, and it would be based on the seasons. So we've covered a portion of the season, and then they said there would be a total of 12 months. I might have said years, but 12 months of sampling required to cover the course of a year.
And their comment on pilot testing?
That they talked about, well, two things in conjunction, pilot testing alone, but also pilot testing in conjunction with the corrosion control study. And part of the thought for all the sources is that pilot testing would have to be done in conjunction with the corrosion control study, and that corrosion control study would be a minimum of 12 months. So yes, I think for any source you'd be looking at, there would be a certain amount of pilot testing required in conjunction with corrosion control study, and that would have to be worked out with IEPA once the source is selected.
Commissioner Herco had asked to be able to make a comment in regard to that question, so I'll recognize Commissioner Herco.
Teresa, I think what you're referring to, and I presented the chairman with this letter, November 6, 2019, IEP, Illinois Environmental Protection Agency letter to you, CC to Allison and Nick Gornick, okay? As I look at the jump to the last paragraph, second to last, reviewers Cook and McDonald say they draw no conclusions about the 3 months worth of data that you've provided, since a longer sample duration is required and some parameters had MCLs that were not included, okay? So when I go up and down Lakeshore Drive, I see Chicago pulling in 1 billion gallons a day, Evanston, Winnetka, Northeast. So what's the logic on voting on this site if there's no guarantee of a permit, maybe till 9 months from now? Because that's the way I read this letter. Am I wrong? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's correct, and we've identified that risk to
Okay.
implementation in
Okay.
the study. So there was additional email correspondence that we received where the statements that Teresa made were stated in that. So we have acknowledged that a risk to implementation, which there's risk to all of the alternatives, is that we would have to do this additional sampling on the Illinois River.
Right. But what I'm thinking here is that by boat, if I go from Lockport down to Canal, the sanitary canal combined with the Des Plaines and the Kankakee, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, okay. And then I go down to Marseilles and I take the 137-mile trip to Peoria, I see 0 other towns pulling from the Illinois River. We would be the first, is that correct?
Between,
Between here and
yeah,
Peoria.
Peoria is the only one that pulls from
That
the
pulls
Illinois River.
nothing for 137 miles, okay?
I don't know the
Now,
exact
and
mileage.
additionally, and if anything's changed, please let me know. Additionally, this, on Thursday, you talked about exhaustive testing, and we know the USGS did 360 different things, came up with 180. I find it a little interesting that your results are different than their 3-year study. The IEPA mentions that you did not test for atrazine, thallium, lindane, dichlorobenzene, the analog, DDT, and dihedrin, okay? Why were those not tested for? And have they been tested for?
I believe DDT was in the sample. I would have to double check. We put together the list and based on IEPA input. So in the original sampling plan, they did not indicate that those were required. So I anticipate that they would be part of any kind of follow-up plan that would be done if the river was selected.
Okay, and has any comparison been done between our results and the USGS results?
Yes, yes.
Okay, and is that available online or anywhere?
I have a table we can provide, but
Okay.
it's what we found. We looked at a couple of different parameters, in particular regarding, ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, phosphorus, kind of traditional wastewater effluent type of parameters. And they were very similar between our sampling and the USGS sampling. From what we found, the number of personal care products, we had sampled more than that. And I would have to take a look at the table we had put together. When we originally met with IEPA, we presented the USGS results, and they indicated that that was not enough information, which is why we put together the sampling plan and did the sampling on the rivers.
Okay. Then just to move forward here, it also seems that they lead off, and I disagree with you on this topic. The engineering reports that it requires a significant amount of information, and it seems that on the city's website, and maybe we're splitting hairs here, that a intake and a treatment plant treating water from the Dresden Pool would be diluted 9 gallons of well water to 1 gallon of pool water. Am I close there, Joe? Does that not sound right? Okay.
I'm not following what you're saying here.
Well, is there an intent to blend our well water with Dresden Pool water?
So in the alternatives that have the online backup supply, the intent was to run about a 10% wells with the river water.
Okay.
And that's mainly to keep the wells running during the time when they're going to the plant. You don't want to have to turn them on and off because you'd have the well collector line lose pressure. And so the intent was to run them for up to 10% of a supplement with the river water supplies, not because it's required or needed, but because that's the way to keep the online backup online.
And on the city website, it said for the Dresden Pool treatment plant, ultraviolet light disinfecting, which is an advance. There's only 2 in the state, and Peoria was the second one. We talked about that. Is that a definitive?
So based on the initial sampling, there wasn't cryptosporidium detected that would place it into bin 1 for the long-term enhanced surface water treatment rule. But we do know there were a couple of facilities on the Kankakee River that are in bin 1 and are installing UV treatment. So we assume that in case it would be required. We don't know that for sure. We'll have to determine that once sampling is done if the alternative is selected.
And then in the first item, it says a description of the watershed noting any existing and potential sources of contamination, highways, railroad yards, chemical facilities, etc. So then you would notify them at that time that the nuclear plant is there, or have they been notified of this?
IEPA, you mean?
Correct, that's who wrote this letter.
Yeah, I mean, they are aware of the facility. They provide an NPDES permit for the
Okay.
Dresden power plant.
Okay, and then can you share with us the difference in cost? My understanding from reading that document dumped at 500-600 pages is that let me word this correctly, I don't want to use the word modifications, but the enhancements needed to our current treatment plants, filtrations, would cost in excess of $120 million, and that was not reflected on the spreadsheet.
So I think you're talking about the distribution system modifications?
Correct.
Okay, So it's not changing the existing treatment. What it is it's constructing a pipeline across the system in order to go from a single point entry to from a multi-point entry to a single point entry. And that was all included in the alternative costs.
Yes, but those costs, when we looked at the spreadsheet, and on the upper right-hand corner, you look at $500 million.
Those were included in there.
Those are included in there.
They are
okay.
included in there.
And I think Nick had spoken before about combining well water with river water, okay, prior to the treatment process.
So that's the well collector network, and that is included in the cost for the Kankakee River options and the Illinois River options.
Okay.
That's the online well collector or well water backup system.
Okay, do these numbers sound correct to you then? Basically, on 30 million gallons a day using river water, depending on whether there's 2% solid or there's 5% solid, basically at 5% solid, our collectors would be collecting roughly 200 tons of solids that are floating in the water, which would then, one, have to go to a landfill, and number two, if they're toxic enough, they would have to go to a separate landfill. Are those additional charges figured in?
So you're saying solids in the well water?
No, solids in the river water.
In the river water. The intake would be constructed to remove or prevent sediment from coming into it, so that then velocities would be maintained through the raw water main to prevent that from settling, if there was anything that came into the pipe. But the intent would be to have some bar screens and other things at the intake to prevent that.
Right, the gentleman that submitted this question did the water treatment here in Joliet for 30 years. And whatever collects these solids then would have to be transported because they're collected. So that seems to be a pretty good expense.
So that would be part of the treatment process, and yes, the treatment process assumes sludge disposal and handling in those operation and maintenance costs.
Okay, now this letter seems to deal with the Illinois and the Kankakee, okay? There's no mention of Lake Michigan. Was the IEPA not contacted about a Lake Michigan source, or is that in a separate letter?
Yeah, I mean, IEPA was discussed with IEPA and with IDEM, both for a Lake Michigan intake.
Okay.
So that was part of all the discussions. We discussed all the potential sources of water.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, an additional question that was received tonight was regarding utilizing the existing system in New Lenox, and I believe, Joe, you could respond to this.
I'm sorry, could you say the question again?
The question was, why don't we utilize the existing Lake Michigan source that's in New Lenox?
Oh, I see, okay, yeah.
When we undertook the Phase 1 study, we identified, I believe, a total of 5 different existing regional water systems that use Lake Michigan water and bring it out to other communities. City of Chicago, DuPage Water Commission, the Illinois American system that comes out to Bolingbrook and Homer Glen, Oak Lawn system that serves other areas there. We talked to all of those suppliers, and one of the first questions we asked them was, where in your system could we connect if we needed to get up to 30 million gallons per day of water to meet Joliet's maximum day demand? And in each of those cases, none of the existing systems, so for example, the DuPage Water Commission indicated that while they have pipes that come all the way out to Naperville and Hoffman Estates, that network does not have the ability to provide a new point source for 30 MGD, so we would have to come all the way back to Elmhurst. Similarly, the systems that serve New Lenox and Homer Glen and Bolingbrook, they indicated that the Illinois American system said they could provide about 12 million gallons per day, at the end of their system right now. So to get to the demand that Joliet needs for a sustainable source, we would not be able to tap into their pipeline there. We would have to basically go all the way back to the city of Chicago. And so that's why moving from phase 1 to phase 2, some of those options were discounted because it didn't make sense to go to a middleman if that middleman doesn't bring the water any closer to us.
Okay, thank you, Joe. There was a question raised about why the Kankakee River was not recommended by staff. The statement was that the basis was because it was, could not be a regional solution. That was one component of the recommendation. The other was that it would limit future growth for the city of Joliet. So the current demand projections were based on 2050 population projections provided by CMAP. However, in CMAP's report, it did show that Joliet and other Will County communities would see population growth beyond 2050. So that was the factor, in addition to not being a regional solution, that influenced staff's decision to not recommend the Kankakee River, that given that Joliet would likely grow beyond 2050, that would be limiting if we selected the Kankakee River. Another comment that I had was, again, regarding the quarries and looking at using the quarries. And I would just comment on that given the unknowns, we did not want to recommend an option that would not be what we believed would be sustainable, and cobbling together a plan that relies on our aquifers, which, as the State Water Survey has mentioned, are not going to be able to be sustainable, in addition to a river source that could be influenced by climate change. We have talked about climate change with experts who study this, and the input we received was that we should expect extremes. Not only extreme rainfall, which would raise the water levels in the river, but also extreme drought. So that was the guidance we received regarding climate change.
And just to be crystal clear, the commission is free to consider any and all options, whether they were recommended by staff or not. Similarly, the city council is free to consider any and all options, including but not limited to the recommendation of this commission.
And just one last comment that I took from my notes from during the comment period was regarding having a legislative agenda, and that is well noted. We have already initiated that process and reached out to our senators and congressmen to make them aware of this project, and then we'll continue that as we proceed in the future with this project. So that is well noted. That concludes all of the comments I have. I don't know if Teresa, Joe, or Jeff made any additional notes. Okay. We'll just turn back to you.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for your participation. Those questions are extremely helpful in us making a decision. I do want to make a few comments that I did appreciate. The two gentlemen sitting in the second row, you've been valuable to me, as well as those who participated in providing me with information. I think that Commissioner Rafek deserves some accolades for subcommittee efforts of sustainability. A number of the members of the audience have come and spoken about the importance of sustainability, and early on in renaming the commission, sustainability was something that all of us viewed as important and stressing to our elected officials, and Maria's undertaken some real modifications and some real changes to help bring this to the community's light, so I appreciate that. As I mentioned, we've been meeting for approximately 2 years now, dating back to Jim Egan before Allison's time, when the mayor decided to renew this commission with the council's support. What I was wanting to do at this point is perhaps start with commissioners' comments, and then from there, at least the way my vision for this, subject to what everyone here thinks, is I'd like to get some sort of general consensus on if we have a consensus relative to quality, sustainability, and governance. Cost being a factor that has just recently started to be discussed and perhaps is best left for the policymakers. But from a sustainability, governance, and quality perspective, if we have a consensus. So I would open the floor for comments. Commissioner Horn.
Are we going to do number 4? We're going to discuss the public forum and the public comments?
I think we just did.
I have a couple slides if you want to do agenda
I
item
thought
5.
that was what you did.
Yeah, so just to recap quickly, the public forum was held on Thursday, December 5th. We had about 150 residents in attendance. Really happy with the turnout, had a lot of really engaged residents who participated by looking at boards that we had displayed, and also had an opportunity to do question and answers, and there were 12 residents who made public comments. And just to identify what public relations activities we conducted prior to the public forum, there were postcards sent to every address in the city. There were radio interviews conducted, multiple radio ads on 3 different radio stations. An ad was run in the Herald News. We had posters hung up across the city at various locations. There were e-blasts, social media posts, advertisements on the billboards, and a press release. And at all times, the public was able to comment by email, website, or phone if they weren't able to attend the public forum. And just to recap on the comments, we compiled a spreadsheet of the public comments received. So far, as of today, there's been 52 comments received, and those were distributed to the Environmental Commission and the City Council. So that was agenda item 5. So we can.
Commissioner Horn.
It's been a quality education that I've received for the last 15 months. It's been kind of fun. I've learned a lot. But I sit here and I struggle with the struggle that we seem to have in convincing everyone that the rivers are a good source of water, sustainable, quality, and cost-effective. I can't agree in any way, shape, or form. For instance, I think that it's been stated quite well about Peoria. It's 107 miles. I measured it on Google, on a Google map. It's 107 miles if you go down the river from the Dresden Pool down to Peoria. Not one community is on that river. Peoria is having an exceptional amount of trouble because of the flooding, the runoff from the fields. It's a difficult situation they're dealing with because it also piles up in their waste treatment center. It's not a good thing. The Kankakee River, by all definitions, is just not adequate to do all of the things that we have been commissioned to do. Find a quality water source, a sustainable water source, and one that we have governance over. The lake meets all of that. It meets it hands down. All of the discussion we just had tonight, for instance, talked about the struggle of making the rivers work. No one has to do anything with the lake. We can just, at whatever point we get permission, permitted, however we decide to draw from the lake, the question of is it a quality source isn't going to come up. Can it have a problem? Absolutely. The oceans have floating masses in them, plastic and other junk. Can we have that source that is pure and simple to get? Nope, not going to happen. And any source that we use is going to be expensive. The gentleman that commented on the a few bucks difference, in fact, I took the Kankakee River versus our own from the lake. It works out to be $218 a year. For 218, assuming the accuracy, and I still, for all of the expertise, nothing personal, but I still don't trust those numbers. They're a guesstimate by qualified experts in the best sense. But if you assume that their relative differences in those costs equate to the cost of water to the customer, between the Kankakee and the lake, it's $218 a year. There will be people that can't afford that, no question. There will be people that cannot afford the water increases that are coming in the next couple of years, without question. And all of that water cost that we're talking about now is really out of date, because we already know it's going to be $35 a month on the average instead of 30. So this is going to change. We're talking about 75 years. I'm an older guy. I'll tell everybody right now, I'm 73 years old. I'm not going to be around when you turn those faucets, and if I am, and I hope I am, it's not going to make any difference to me. This is for the future. If we needed this source for the next 25 or 30 years, Kankakee River would be fine. We wouldn't have to worry about it. But we'd have to do it again, and that's the problem. The challenge is, what are we going to do 50, 60, 75 years from now? We're going to do this again? Water is going to become the asset to have. And property values, that's a specious argument. I mean, I can name without, I don't want to get into community challenges here, but there is no reason why one community is rated with a higher value than another community. I live in the house. I'm satisfied. Doesn't make any difference when I'm in that house where I live. The schools where I live are very expensive. Doesn't matter. I'm satisfied. So that argument that somehow your property values won't be affected, they will be affected at some point, because you're going to have commercial economic growth. You're going to have residential growth, and people, I don't know who it was, their children were looking for a house. Yeah, they mentioned water. My wife's a realtor. I can tell you, they ask about water. It may not deter them from buying there, because they get their water from Aqua, although maybe it would if they actually read the papers. But the reality is that the only sustainable quality source that will allow us to govern and effectively into the future is the lake. I will have a motion to make at the point that it's necessary that defines that. So, thank you.
Commissioner Biley.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners Horn and Hertko have both spoken extensively about the folly of going to the river, either the Illinois River or the Kankakee River. I will state that I agree with them. And from the comments I've heard from the public, that seems to be the general sentiment of the community. There's not a groundswell of support for going to either of the two rivers. And so we haven't heard from that end of the forum yet, but I think we could speed this process up if we just maybe ask that question right off the bat here. Is there any support on this commission for going to either of the two rivers? And if there isn't, we can start talking about the other two options.
I'll make it. I have
Can
a
I
motion.
make a motion?
Well, I don't know that it's,
We can
I
have
don't
a
think it's,
consensus
I don't know
Discussion?
that we're prepared to make a motion yet. Does anyone else have any comments, or is everyone in agreement with Lake Michigan, or is there an alternative different than that, or have any opinions one way or the other? Any river supporters? Are there any other commissioners that wish to speak at this time?
Well, I think the public should know that whatever decision we do make, the EPA will never leave. I've been a past president of a water association, and I know every month we had to do testing, send them into the EPA. That's going to continue whichever source we take. So the main thing now is that it will last our sustainability for over 50 years. Again, we don't need to do it twice.
The agenda provides, though, oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Rathek.
I did.
Oh, Commissioner Rodriguez.
So we've been meeting for 2 years now, and I just really wanted to say thank you all for all of your hard work and dedication. And every question that I've been asking to friends, family, and residents in my community has always been, which water do you prefer? And the common consensus that I've heard has been Lake Michigan. My family has 5 generations from this community, and I will not be here at some point in my life, right? And I think of my great-great-great-grandchildren at that point in time. Which water source are they going to have, and which reliability will they have for their futures? So I just really wanted to say how much of an honor it's been to serve on the commission, and what an educational opportunity it's been to hear and be a part of the process. And I just wanted to make sure I had some public comments before we call for a vote.
Commissioner Rathek?
I too would like to say thank you. Thank you to the public that has engaged and that keep coming to these meetings and sending the information in and telling us what you think. There is a handful plus of us up here determining the water source for 150,000 individuals. So something that you could tell that none of us take very lightly. I would like to make a comment too, to thank our consultants who have been very diligent. For those of you who may not be familiar with how construction and engineering processes and design works, we start in concept, we start with schematics, and those numbers can only be conceptual, and the work that they've done to pull that together has been astounding. Next, we'll move to design development, where we start to look at the details and we dig deeper into the costs and the barriers that we will come across, and those numbers will change. And then we'll get to contract documents, that final piece before we're ready to hand it off to someone to build, and those numbers will change again a little bit. And then we have our construction costs, and I'm sure we'll be on time and under budget. So I want to again thank them for their diligence. We rely on their expertise, their education, them staking their reputations and their businesses and the future of those companies on what they've done here for the city of Joliet for almost 2 years. I want to thank Allison and the staff, the mayor, the city council, all of those who have presented and provided us this forum. And I would just like to remind everyone, don't kill the messenger. Allison has been a great liaison. She has neither put together these numbers or steered this committee. She has simply tried to uphold her job and try to uphold her commitment to the public. It is part of her job description. It is part of her title, that it is the public works, and that we will make a decision for all of you. Again, I thank you for your comments. I hope nobody is disappointed with the work that we have done. Again, many are coming in a little late to the game, but we're just beginning. We meet once a month to to discuss water conservation issues and what we can be doing to move forward. And I invite you all to come help us and help us continue the work. We are starting to do some real exciting things. And I believe that 2020 will be the year that we can get Joliet to rethink water. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Kaufman.
So I said from the beginning, all I really cared about was to just to make sure this gets done before we run out. I saw it as a matter of life and death, and it would be a huge matter of scandal, and it would be a black eye on this city if we were not able to get this done. And I'm happy that we've narrowed down the options to all what I see as good options. Without getting into it, my personal preferences in politics tend to value and think first of those that are most vulnerable and least well off. Still talking to everyone around the city and getting perspective, and also just knowing a sense of investment and public relations, lack of questions and concern, and also long-term sustainability. I do also come down with the side of the Lake Michigan, one of the Lake Michigan options. So thank you.
Thank you. Further comments?
Chairman, do you have any?
Do I get to make any?
Well, Commissioner Herco, go ahead.
Please, thank you. First, I'd like to thank you, Chairman Davidson, for being a good person and a good chairman, okay? A lot of ups, a lot of downs. I sincerely believe that all the information that I brought forth, and Wayne and everybody, was an attempt to make an evidence-based decision. But there's two things that I'd like to make aware to the public. One, the nicest thing that happened to me in the last 16 months was a text that man with a beard sent to me Thursday night. It was a terrific text, and it was the nicest thing everybody ever said to me. And the other thing that I'd like to make aware to the public, and I only found this out 2 weeks ago. I was watching a documentary, reading about a very bad place. It was the A Sha Valley in Vietnam, 1968, 1969. As Mo Green said to Michael Corleone, when you were dating cheerleaders, I was earning my bones. In 1968, 1969, I was trying to date cheerleaders. I wasn't good enough looking, and I didn't have as much money. But this guy here was in the A Sha Valley. Google it. Hill 973, Hamburger Hill, 101st Airborne. He was defending our country. I never knew anyone up here prior to getting appointed. Okay, this guy here, he's a hero in my book. That's what I gotta say.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Damn, we're gonna sing Kumbaya too?
Don't get that close.
And thank you, Commissioner Horn.
Thank you.
I don't know exactly how I want to handle item number 7. It seems as though, it's obvious we have a consensus for Lake Michigan. We've been charged with recommending two alternatives to the city council, which of course everybody on the board recognizes that the city council is free to adopt or not. Without any specific predisposed notion on how to do that, Commissioner Horn previously said he does have a motion, so we might as well go ahead and just hear that motion and then decide if it's something that we're all in agreement with. So Commissioner Horn.
I am proposing a motion to recommend the selection of a primary water source alternative that does not include any cost comparisons at this time. we have a consensus that it will be Lake Michigan, and I make that motion that we recommend Lake Michigan as the primary water source. And I, as an addendum to that, or just a comment to that, there is no other source that will give us the combination that this commission has been charged with finding. And Lake Michigan is less than 40 miles away. So with that, I make the motion that we recommend Lake Michigan.
Second.
Motion's made by Commissioner Hort, seconded by Commissioner Kaufman. Discussion. One thing that I would point out that we might want to consider in amending Commissioner Horn's motion would be that there are a number of Lake Michigan options, including the City of Chicago, Indiana intake, among others. In the event that we are charged with having two alternatives, and we have a consensus relative to Lake Michigan, it would seem intuitive to me that we should narrow down those Lake Michigan options. Does anybody have any comments relative to that?
I would concur.
Okay.
I assume that following this motion and this vote, that we will follow that possibly with another motion in which one of those options is prioritized.
We could do that.
Or could we amend the motion to not say that we motion to use Lake Michigan, but what I think Commissioner Horn is trying to say is that we motion not to move Illinois or the Kankakee forward.
That would, yes, I struggled. So thank you for correcting my struggle, yes.
Is that a motion, Murray?
That is.
I think it's an amendment to the
It
motion.
merely recognizes that the,
That's how I understood it.
An amendment? Okay.
There's been a motion and a second, and there's discussion, and I knew you guys were going to challenge my parliamentary understanding this evening. Prior to entertaining a friendly amendment to the motion, which Mr. Horn can agree to, I would say we should have some further discussion regarding what that motion should be so that we don't have 27,000 amendments. Let's, if I could offer as an example, the motion might say something as follows. Not that I'm suggesting that this would be what the motion is, it's just an alternative. That the commission recommend the City of Chicago, the motion would be made to recommend Lake Michigan from a quality, sustainability, and governance perspective without any opinion as to cost, and pursuing the specific, so Indiana intake or what have you.
The only issue I see with that, doesn't the Lake Michigan Chicago option offer two options, we own or we don't? Like we purchase the pathway or we don't. So that would seem to pre-knock out one of those options if we included the governance in that statement. Not that I'm not stating my opinion, I'm just concerned about at this point for that motion.
well,
We currently have a motion on the floor, right?
we're
And a second.
discussing.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think Commissioner Horn's motion needs any amendment. All it states is that we're going to eliminate the two river options, basically. And from this point forward, we're only going to consider Lake Michigan options.
And there may be other options added at another time, we don't know.
So is it the
For Lake
intent?
Michigan. I bring that, I would like to bring that into the discussion because it didn't get mentioned before. But there is the issue of the Great Lakes Compact, which we have been assured, I have sought other council assurances, but at best, it's still not for sure. We're going to have to, it's a process that's going to take a while. We're going to have to go forward with that and find that out. So there is that slight possibility that doesn't work going through Hammond. So
Chairman, just one point. Just want to explain the agenda items. There was two agenda items, motion for a primary water source and a secondary water source. And to Commissioner Horn's point, with any of the options, there is unknowns that would be explored further during the preliminary design phase. So that is why we're seeking, two alternatives. They could be both Lake Michigan options, but we are looking for direction on that, so that if there are issues with one, then there is the alternative option that could be utilized. And so we would then, if the motions are for a primary and a secondary, we would then proceed with evaluating both of those further during the preliminary design phase.
That is the intention of the motion.
I'm not sure how many motions and how many amendments there are. I lost track, okay? What I understood is that Lake Michigan is the source, okay? Now, from all the data we've been given, there's three ways. Chicago purchase, in Indiana intake, and on November 13th, the concept of a Southland Water Commission, was eliminated. From everything I've heard and read, the federal government, the state government wants a regional approach. They want cities to work together. So I would like to suggest that the concept of a commission modeled like the 1985 DuPage Water Commission legislation be one of the three. They all speak to Lake Michigan water. They all speak to three different ways to access the Michigan water, Lake Michigan water. And that would give, similar to what you see at Home Depot, buy this wrench, it's a good wrench, buy this wrench, it's a better wrench, or buy the best wrench. It'd give the taxpayers the alternative and give us Lake Michigan water. Does that sound reasonable, or?
So I agree with almost everything you said. I don't believe that, at least in my mind, and I haven't eliminated it, I don't believe that the Southland Water Commission has ever been eliminated as an option. In fact, I think it's an extremely viable option for the city to pursue.
Right.
The fact that it wasn't included was, my understanding, is simply because they don't have the immediate availability to deliver water, though that is a constantly moving process, and it's my understanding that that ball has moved further down the field just in the last few weeks. So I don't think that if the commission were to vote to recommend that as its number one choice to have an Indiana intake, that would preclude, as part of that Indiana intake, engaging with Southland Water Commission.
Well, right, it's however you want to word it. I mean, in 1985, the DuPage Water Commission formed on paper with 3 cities. It took 7 years to pump their water. So however you want to organize the verbiage is okay with me. I just feel that if you look at their RFI, which Wayne and I did, and their conceptual plan, which Maria says, we're in the concept phase, you will see that by sharing certain costs, this might not only appeal to the taxpayers, but it will appeal to federal and state governments when it comes time for grants and aid to be awarded.
So again, Allison, panel of experts, commissioners, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that in the event that we were to recommend Lake Michigan with an Indiana intake, that would be inclusive of the ability for the city of Joliet to pursue a pipeline and put a straw into Lake Michigan on a go-it-alone basis per se, or to be the regional supplier of water itself, or alternatively to be in a regional group such as Southland Water. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
That's fine.
And similarly, if I may speak, if the commission were to recommend that we go to Chicago as our water source, I don't think we need to go to that level tonight of whether we're going to own the pipeline or not own the pipeline.
Correct.
We're just talking in very broad strokes here.
Correct.
I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's any limit to the number of motions that we can introduce and pass tonight. We can pass 8 motions if we want to.
Correct.
Despite what the agenda said.
Correct. What I'm thinking, though, as we have this discussion is, provided that Commissioner Horn would agree, that we build consensus around what that motion would look like, at which point then Commissioner Horn could withdraw his motion and re-articulate it. Commissioner Kaufman could then second it, if in fact Commissioner Horn was okay with that, and then we could have the one motion so that it's all clean.
I think with that understanding, that there's no limit to the number of motions we can pass.
Correct.
We should start with the things that we agree with broadly, and then we could start to narrow it down. I think that Commissioner Horn's motion would pass unanimously if we were to vote in the next 3 minutes. Perhaps we should start that.
So there's
and
been a
then move on
motion,
to
motion made to call the question.
And I agree
The
with
wrap,
all
question has been called.
the wrap it up motion.
The question has been called. The motion is that the recommendation of Lake Michigan as the primary source for the water for the city of Joliet has been made. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is that the correct resuscitation of the motion, Commissioner Kaufman?
That second remains.
Does anybody object to how I phrased that? Okay. Motion's been made and seconded. There's been discussion. Clerk can call the vote.
Commissioner Beely?
Aye.
Commissioner Hertko?
Aye.
Commissioner Horn?
I do have to say, I like that idea that I've been questioned and corrected. And I hope the press gets that correct. And my name spelled correctly. Yes.
Chairman Davidson?
Present, or yes.
Commissioner Kaufman?
Yes.
Commissioner Rafek?
Yes.
Commissioner Riggs?
Yes.
Commissioner Rodriguez?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. Are there further discussion? Do we want to continue to break this down a little farther?
I don't know about y'all, but I feel after all that process, that deserves a round of applause for that. So, I mean, after like 2 years, I mean, like, you know, so, all right.
I do have a quick question. If we're looking at Chicago, us or them, Indiana, Southland or something else, and then this concept of our own commission, either way for a regional source, do we need to further narrow because we have 2 options?
So I'll just comment that the exact governance structure is not what is on the agenda to be determined. At this time, we're looking at the source. So in my mind, given the previous motion regarding Lake Michigan, then there's 2 options, which would be a new intake in Indiana or purchasing water from the city of Chicago. And for either of those options, a commission or regional solution could be formed. We would, with this direction, then proceed to have those conversations with regional partners. We would continue to have conversations with Southland Water Agency. The Public Water Commission still exists, and that could be the format utilized. So that is something that would then be discussed further with the City Council after the selection is made regarding the source. So again, I'll just state that the reason we're looking for direction on a primary and secondary source is just as you start to move forward with those discussions, there could be unknown issues that arise. And so that way then staff would have direction on how to proceed if there is, an unknown issue that comes up with those. So that is, at this point, what we're considering would be a primary and a secondary between those 2 Lake Michigan alternatives.
And just to confirm, both of these will move to DDs, and both of these will be developed with better numbers for us?
So what we would move forward with doing is a further, preliminary design with a primary source. However, if, as Chairman Davidson was suggesting, for example, if you said the primary source is the new Indiana intake, we would then begin moving forward with a preliminary design based on that option. However, with a secondary source, we would still continue to have conversations with Chicago because we would need to have that negotiation in case there was an issue with the Indiana option. For example, we would have to get access to the lake, and those conversations, that negotiation would have to take place with an Indiana community to gain that access. So all of that would happen, after the source was selected, but we would not do a full-blown preliminary design of both. We would focus on the preliminary design, the primary option, until there was an issue with that option.
Thank you.
So at this time, I would be looking for a motion to recommend a selection of a primary water source alternative to pass along to the city council.
Is there a way we could do maybe like a straw poll for the first, just so we can see where people are in that, and maybe like, as opposed to like one vote and then aye or nay, because then that predisposes one or the other. It's like, what is your preference, one at a time kind of thing, or is that something we can do, or? You see, my concern is if we say, okay, someone makes a motion for one or the other, then that kind of already gets, a value or something like that, as opposed to where are we on this? We might already be unanimous.
How do you, we'll just walk down, Commissioner Biley, where are you at on this?
I currently am in favor of Chicago Department of Water Management as our primary source.
And Commissioner Herco.
I'm not sure if I agree on the primary, secondary source, okay, of entities, okay? And for this reason, they're so drastically different, okay? Since we've identified Lake Michigan, okay, and there's Chicago and our pipeline, the numbers are so drastically different. The engineering is so drastically different, okay? I firmly believe that the federal government, the state government, and any grant money, federal money, will not come to us if we try to monopolize a pipeline just for Joliet. I don't think Joliet, with bonds and other issues, can come close to affording $1 billion, okay? I've seen no actuarial charts to indicate otherwise, okay? So, I don't know if that could be deferred a little bit, and my suggestion would be the Illinois State Water Task Force is composed of the IDNR people, state people, the USGS. They're meeting tomorrow, okay? And I would like to see a conference with them and us and the city of Chicago and other interested parties so we could get some more clarity as to cost, and we're not spinning our wheels with conceptual plans that down the road they may say, no, you're wasting your time. This is the way we want you to do it. So beyond Lake Michigan, that's about as far as I can go.
Okay. Commissioner Herco.
Horn.
Horn.
He's tall. I feel the same way. I mean, it seems that if we're choosing the lake, we're choosing the lake. How we work that out from here, this commission could be tasked with some of that effort. It is up to the city council if they want to pursue that path. I think if we recommended the lake, we've recommended, and we're saying to them that our recommendation is the lake, how we can choose that path is going to be determined by many things. It's the requirements, the permitting, and so forth. So I don't want to handcuff them. I don't want to handcuff the recommendation.
And may I add, I don't think the council would be upset if we pushed things off a month and heard from this Illinois State Water Task Force, because number one, they're in charge of the permitting, they're in charge of the direction, they're in charge of everything, okay? And I don't think it could hurt to hear more information. And quite frankly, I think some of the expectations by some of the people that spoke tonight, okay, there's no way this is going to occur, in my opinion, without Chicago being involved. Chicago has one thing that nobody else has. Chicago has the technical expertise in operating, managing, delivering water, 1 billion gallons a day. Chicago has the political influence and the money to control. So I don't think, I think it's pie in the sky if Joliet thinks they can do one pipeline by themselves and sell the water. There's been no evidence-based decision-making and empirical data that provides that, okay? So I don't want to take up any more time.
But when Chicago's representatives were here, John, you were asking, is there anything that you're doing that we can't do? And you brought up there's the UV radiation, and there's the, the filtration, the carbon, this, that, and the third, which actually made me think you were going the other way on that one, that there's nothing that you're doing that we can't do.
Well, there's a difference between doing something and doing it well, okay? And we really didn't get into the politics of water distribution, okay? And, my belief is our model is going to have to be modeled after the 1985 DuPage Water Commission legislation, which I believe we qualify under, okay? But don't mistake tough questions by me as, it's Chicago. You got to be tough with them, okay? So that's just my opinion.
And I'm gonna get down to this side too, but, am I understanding, you, Commissioner Herco and Commissioner Horn, in saying that at some point in some undefined period in the future, we would further elaborate to the city council a specific direction? Because I read a 600-page report, received a decision-making matrix, and played around with it. My understanding coming into the meeting tonight was that I was going to provide my recommendation to the city of council to provide a greater degree of clarity than simply Lake Michigan. But if we're going to defer that, that's one thing, but, there was a tremendous amount of analysis relative to those various options on Lake Michigan. I came into this meeting with choice one being Indiana in some way, shape, fashion, or form, and choice two being the city of Chicago. And from there, that provided a greater amount of direction to the city council as to what our analysis was, but also provided them with the ability to make a decision as policymakers from a cost and governance perspective on the various options within those options.
Well, to clarify what I'm saying, I agree.
Okay.
I want to go with Hammond. Do we need to specify a second alternative?
Yeah, I mean,
Besides, I don't know why, I'm not sure why we need to, I guess.
I mean, I have-
My question. Why do we need to?
Why do we need
Yeah.
to? I mean, it's-
You know, it would.
If we can keep on going down the,
For sure.
Yeah, let's do that.
so that we
All
can,
right, so I think we're on you.
I think he did.
You just did, didn't you?
Yeah.
If I were going to say, just in terms of the priority of governance for most people involved, and the fact that we have a unique asset that could be useful to the city, I'm towards the Hammond, Indiana option. And especially because if the funding for that could be spread out over 30, 40, 50 years, and then after that, those prices go down, and then we have, by then, certainly a network of buyers. I think Kathy's point that she brought up, these are hypotheticals, but these are things that people can't live without, and it's, I mean, that doesn't sound so positive necessarily, but I don't think we would be hurting for, I'm guessing, to get people involved. So I think that the Indiana option is my view.
I would say Chicago.
I would say Joliet needs to keep control as much as they can, and they need to be the backbone of the community and the surrounding area. So I think Joliet needs to take it on. I know it's a big responsibility to build their own pipeline and distribute it to the other areas. Along, it'll help with the expenses, and I'm fulfilling over the period of time, it'll self-support itself. And Chicago, making our own pipeline.
So you're saying Chicago, or you want Chicago or Indiana?
Chicago through Indiana way or up into Indiana, so it'll be basically making our own pipeline from Lake Michigan.
just to clarify, was that Hammond?
It would
Or
be
from
through
Cook
probably
County?
Hammond, if that's the only way that we can.
So
get the
Hammond would
lake
be your
out of-
primary?
If that's the way that we gotta get the water out of Lake Michigan.
Again, just to clarify my comments, then we'll move on to Commissioner Rodriguez. I was suggesting that we have it be an Indiana intake, which would take into account Commissioner Hertko's concerns in terms of pigeonholing us is with respect to a specific community to negotiate with respect to opportunities to engage with Southland, with respect to opportunities to have further discussions with the city of Chicago, which may or may not, preclude us from having those conversations as a regional water supplier, even if we were to go through an Indiana site. So I would keep that as broad as possible and refer to it as Indiana intake rather than a specific community.
is that your,
No, I'm just giving my opinion.
And I will consider it Indiana intake if that's where we gotta get the water from Lake Michigan from, and build our own pipeline and keep control of the prices that way.
My primary would be the Hammond, Indiana intake.
with your explanation then, and those alternatives, then I'll go with the Indiana intake.
Okay.
Commissioner,
If we're taking a vote, one.
point of order real quick. I'd just like to make a motion then,
Yes.
since we kind of went down. I'd like to make a motion that the Hammond intake as the primary source and the Chicago as the second.
Would you entertain a friendly amendment to refer to that as the Indiana intake rather than the Hammond intake?
Yes, sir.
Is there further, so there's been a motion made for the primary to be Indiana intake, the secondary to be City of
second.
Chicago. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Hertko. Further discussion?
Horn, he's Horn, I'm Hertko.
He's taller.
I'm taller.
He's the hero.
He's the
You're
hero
the
of my
troublemaker.
book, you know?
Okay, there's been a motion and no one disagreed with that, by the way. We even have consensus from the audience.
See, I'm glad because it's usually me.
There's been a motion made and seconded. Is there further discussion?
Just to make sure that all options on that Indiana intake, including Southland Commission, Chicago, all of that's included, right?
That's, I think we've made the record very clear on that.
Have we? Okay, then.
Okay, no, if there's no further discuss, there is further discussion, Commissioner
Yes.
Byler.
Since this seems to be, we're headed for a vote here, I would like to explain why I support the Chicago option.
Yes, thank you very
Over
much.
the Indiana option. I'm not saying anything new when I say that the Indiana option has a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that can go wrong. The compact has been talked about, crossing the state lines has been talked about. Plus, you're starting from scratch, building a whole new system. My fear is we decide in 2020 that we're going to go to Indiana, and we tell Chicago, thanks, but no thanks, we're going a different route. And then 2 or 3 years from now, Joliet stubs its toe and finds out that the Indiana option is not going to work. Now what do? You go back to Chicago with your hat in your hand and say, hey, about that water you guys wanted to sell us, let's make a deal. And Chicago's, they may be receptive or they may not. But right now, at this time, Chicago is receptive. They are wanting to make a deal with us. And if Joliet's going to get a good deal from Chicago, it's going to happen in 2020, not 2023 or 2024. So I think that should be considered. Once you start down that path to Indiana, you're kind of boxing yourself in.
I would like to-
agree. I'm sorry.
I was just
agree-
going to say, I would like to comment additionally for Chicago. That was part of the reason I thought as well, that not only are there many moving parts, but we would have to negotiate with across state lines. But I look at, even if we're not looking at cost of the system, the operations and maintenance cost for us to own and operate a plant across state lines is going to be an outrageous cost moving forward forever. And so I think operations and maintenance, because the cost to build it is a one-time deal, but the cost to maintain it and send people out there, and unless we're going to be using local staff, and I'm not so sure how the locals will think of us using our staffs if we're not using the staff of the people where the plant is. So I think that was some of the things that I thought about in selecting Chicago as our first choice. And as Commissioner Herco indicated, they've been doing it for a long time. They know what they're doing. And so I believe that's why I think Chicago would be a better choice.
And I agree with parts of what Marie says, Rafek, and Jim Riggs, and Mike Biley. What I'm suggesting, no matter what you want to call it, it's a hybrid. So let's look a little bit further and see what's going on in other states. In Wisconsin, there's legislation to restrict water prices because water is a human right. Mayor Lightfoot from Chicago has expressed those concerns. Water is a human right. There are other cities further west in Lake Michigan that are saying, we don't care if we're named in the compact or not, we're Americans, we're entitled to this water, okay? This is not the time to do it alone, okay? What this gentleman said and what Maria said is it's time to join forces. I know I see one city manager out there that has talked to me, and I'm not going to name him. He says, we can go to Illinois American, we can go to DuPage, but we're not going to go to Joliet unless we get a seat at the table. So, hybrid. And Chicago has the expertise, and to make your O&M, as Maria states, and I call her Rafek, East Side Slovaks, we say Rafek, okay? To me, that's the primary thing, is Joliet has a seat at the table Maybe not 100%, maybe 51, but we're supposed to work together, and that's what the government wants, a regional solution. So that's what
I
we're talking
think
about.
we're all kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
that This is really, again, I don't think that we need to consider this to be mutually exclusive. I mean, the art of negotiation is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Thus, it is imperative that we provide the city council and staff with the opportunity to have an alternative. Otherwise, you're only negotiating with one party, which makes it very difficult to have a successful outcome for your negotiation. So we could refer to this as 1A and 1B. B, after further analysis and vetting out exactly how we're going to do that, could easily become A, and A could as easily become B. But with the information that I currently have, having read the entire report, done the decision-making matrix, et cetera, that provided that we can address Commissioner Biley, Commissioner Herco, and Commissioner Rafek's concerns, I believe Indiana, in some way, shape, fashion, or form, presents the best alternative for the city.
And I can just clarify too that if this motion proceeds, it doesn't mean that we would stop all communications with Chicago.
Right.
We would continue to talk to them because, as you mentioned, it's an evolving process with them. They are currently performing a rate analysis and looking at their governance structure. So if there's major changes that occur, that information can then be reevaluated. But the intent of the way this was structured was to provide that direction to move forward with this preferred alternative. So
There has been a motion made and seconded. Is there further discussion?
I would like to further express some reservations about the Indiana intake option, since this is my last chance.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out that the proposed intake in Indiana, wherever it may be, Hammond or wherever, is 5 miles closer to the industrial complex that sits on the Indiana shore there. Steel mills and refineries that, as recently as August of this year, were leaking fairly large quantities of cyanide and ammonia into the lake. That is a concern to me. The Chicago intake that we would be using if we went to Chicago is 5 miles further north, away from all that industry.
Can I ask, 5 miles closer, and then how much further is it to what you're referring to?
The two intakes, as best I can plot them on the
They're
map.
5 miles apart,
are
right?
5 miles apart.
So here's Chicago, here's Indiana intake, and then how much further along is this?
Well, that
concerns
complex goes all the way from Gary to Burns Harbor.
Okay.
And beyond. Now, that particular spill that I talked about, I think was at Burns Harbor, which was about 10 miles east of where the proposed intake would be. But there are plants and things all along that shoreline.
Can I add to his concern, but maybe a solution? I've spoken to the IDNR on that topic, okay, and I've asked that question. And there are water dynamic studies that our consultants could bring to us and alleviate any fears that you have, any concerns, and I think that would be appropriate, because I had those concerns too. Okay, they're very legitimate, okay? It deals with the placement, how far out, like the cribs are so far out, et cetera, okay? Can you ask that be looked at of the consultants?
I can, Joe Johnson can comment on this. That was addressed in the study on a conceptual nature as far as the location of the proposed intake.
Yes, Commissioner, you're absolutely right. I mean, when siting an intake in the lake, there are a number of considerations. The first one is water quality, and then where does it need to go? The Chicago intakes are I don't know the exact length, but 2 to 3 miles out into the lakes. They're fairly far out, and they're constructed as tunnels under the lake bed with large structures, large crib structures. Generally, most of the other intakes on the west shore of Lake Michigan, so Evanston, Wilmette, Winnetka, Northbrook on up the list. Generally, those extend about a mile out into the lake. When we did do the conceptual analysis for the intake down in Indiana, there were some discussions. I believe the RFI, the Southland indicated they were looking at going out about 2 miles. We split the difference. We were about 1.5 miles is the cost basis that we have in there. But you're absolutely right. As part of the analysis, that would be a critical part of that to look at the hydrodynamics of the water flow and what's the appropriate length to go out there. I think with 1.5 miles built into our cost and a 30% contingency, we have some allowance for going out further than what's currently done on the west shore of the lake. But that is a factor that has to be looked at as the design goes forward. And I suspect that that's an issue that the regulators would want to see as well.
But regardless, unless you're going to extend it 7 miles into the lake, the fact remains that the Chicago intake is considerably further away from that industrial complex than any intake that we could construct in Indiana.
Clerk, call the roll.
But I have one more concern that I'd like to express. And Commissioner Hurtko already spoke to this eloquently. The Chicago Department of Water Management supplies water to some 5 million people in northern Illinois. It has an annual budget of $900 million and has been supplying Lake Michigan water for well over 120 years. It has the resources and expertise to monitor pollution and polluters. It is very vigilant about protecting its water sources from polluters. And as the third largest city in America, it has the clout in both Springfield and Washington to get something done if and when something needs to be done. And I'm not knocking Joliet, but as an historical, well-water city, 1/20th the size of Chicago, Joliet simply does not have the resources, the clout, the expertise, or the experience that Chicago Department of Water Management has. There was a gentleman who spoke the other night, and I didn't catch his name, who was a former chemist for the Joliet Water Department. He spoke of this as well. They have lots of people with advanced degrees working as water operators in those plants, and of course, their bosses as well. It's just no escaping the fact that Chicago Water Management is one of the premier water suppliers in the world. And for Joliet to think that they can match that, and it's no shame. There's no shame in the fact that we're not Chicago.
So the question I would have, Commissioner Biley, is, again, I don't view either of these options as mutually exclusive. So once these are advanced to the City Council, the team that we've assembled would be further evaluating this. And my question to you would be as follows. In the event that after further analysis by the City Council and our team, if your concerns were addressed and it was determined to be viable for us to, through either regional cooperation, through Southland Water Commission, on our own, or perhaps even with an Indiana intake with the City of Chicago cooperation, if we were to do that, if that were to be accomplished, would you have any further concerns?
I readily admit that it is viable to go to Indiana. If things go properly, everything goes according to Hoyle, yes, Joliet could do that. But it would not, frankly, match the quality of quality control that Chicago can provide. Joliet cannot do that. It does not have the resources to do so.
But again, the question that I would have is, in the event that it were to be determined after further evaluation that they could meet those standards, would Indiana be a viable solution?
If it was determined that Joliet could hire a bunch of master and PhD degree people to run this water system, and that's what we were going to do, so that we would try to match the resources and the expertise that Chicago has, sure, that'd be great.
So again, I don't view these as mutually exclusive.
Well, they are mutually exclusive.
No, in terms of advancing them, they are not mutually exclusive. They're going to both be, they're not mutually exclusive insofar as we are advancing them to the council for further evaluation by our team members, such that we are choosing 1A and 1B. We're not choosing 1 and 2.
That is right.
Because again, the art of negotiation is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So
We are charged with prioritizing 1A and 1B, and we're having that discussion.
Right,
I am expressing why I think Chicago should be 1A,
right. No, I agree.
and I have done that, so.
Chairman, may I
now we
ask?
can-
Allison, can you add further clarification after today, after this vote? What proceeds?
So we would proceed with presenting the commission's recommendation and then to the city council, and they would have similar motions to select a primary water source and to select a secondary water source.
Could I ask a question of Joe?
Yes.
Joe, is there data that shows how far the intake for Hammond is into the lake? And I take it that's further south than our proposed one, correct? So,
The city of Hammond's existing intake is not, I think it's 5,000 to 6,000 feet at longest. I'm not sure the exact length, but we can determine
okay,
that.
so to help Commissioner Biley, Hammond would have to report to the federal government and the Indiana IEPA the water standards of their raw water, the water standards of their treated water, the methods with which they treat the water. So if we were to obtain those statistics, then we could look at them together and hypothesize that if this is working for Hammond, okay, then there's a pretty good chance it would work for us. If they're out 5,000, you said 5,000 feet?
I have to confirm that, but it's less than 8,000.
It's less than 8,000. So it's a little compare and contrast, and then that might give us an extra comfort level. Is that possible? I mean,
That data is available. Any
Okay.
water
Would that
utility
help?
on the lake has reports raw and finished water data.
Some comfort level, yes.
okay, yeah, maybe that would help with the comfort level before this gets to the council, but we could still move forward on it, okay? And you could hold
We
your.
certainly should move forward on it.
Okay.
We should take a vote and see where the chips fall.
Okay.
All right, Commissioner Beely.
Can I make a comment? In terms, I trust experts. I trust qualified experts, and that's one of the pillars of my philosophy towards life. I trust people that know more than I do, and the more people learn, the more humble they become about how little they actually know. Right? That's a mark of expertise. I think a project like this, if it is the price that we're looking at, Joliet, let's say if that were to happen, votes on $1.1 billion, Indiana water option. That's going to attract talent. That's going to attract those people, the experts. Now, no, we don't have the resources to make it as big as Chicago. It doesn't have to be, and therefore there's part of a chicken and the egg there in terms of, well, they have to, they have that large population. But what I would say in terms of concerns is that a project that size, and of course we would be paying people, I believe it would attract talent. So I just wanted to say that.
I would like to call a question.
Question's been called.
Okay,
We'll call the roll.
all right. Commissioner Beely.
No?
Commissioner Hertko.
Aye.
Commissioner Horn.
Aye.
Chairman Davidson.
Aye.
Commissioner Kaufman.
Aye.
Commissioner Rafak.
No.
Commissioner Riggs.
Aye.
Commissioner Rodriguez.
Aye.
Okay. I will just state that there's another meeting at 7 in this room. So if we could accelerate the remaining agenda items.
Commissioner Rafik?
So I would like to invite everyone to our next water conservation meeting, which will be in January after the holidays. All are welcome, or you can even email, call, go online to submit some of your ideas. We have some very interesting things that We have partnered with individuals across the education and communications and institutions in Joliet, and we are hoping that we will be able to move forward. So for the sake of time, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
The date.
I don't know that we have, did you confirm you can do 4 o'clock?
Yeah.
Fourth Thursday?
So it would be January 23rd at 4 o'clock. And we meet right in the conference room here. So please, join us. We'd love to hear your ideas and have you help us.
Thank you. Any new or old business? Don't think so, okay. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? Anybody?
Second.
Horn, Filey?
Okay.
We're adjourned.